Situation: the 12 tribes of Israel are locked in a deadly feud. Mission: unify the nation, conquer Jerusalem, and secure the borders in 1000 BC. Execution: use infantry and guerrilla warriors. Command and control: King David. Welcome to Conquerors. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Most of what we think we know about King David's military career comes from the Bible. It's a story where the truth lies somewhere between faith and fact. Indeed, most historians and archaeologists are reluctant to speculate about what the real story is. And yet there is a window that allows us a look into the world of the 10th century BC, the time we believe King David lived and reigned. The Bible tells us that this was his weapon of choice. History tells us it was the weapon of choice of many ancient warriors. The sling was lightweight, ammunition was clearly easy to find, and it allowed a warrior to attack his enemy while keeping his own distance. Used properly, the sling could be deadly. And it may well have been the weapon which catapulted King David into the pages of history. We know him best as the ultimate underdog, the legendary slayer of Goliath, the real conqueror of Jerusalem, and the unifier of Israel. But what do we really know of the man? The wife collector, the charismatic leader. Celebrated for centuries by artists of all forms, David has been decidedly more myth than man. But his footing became more solid in 1993, when archaeologists made a remarkable discovery. They found a stone tablet in Israel bearing the inscription, House of David. It dates back nearly 3,000 years.
This suggests to some scholars and archaeologists that David was a real historical figure, and that the exploits that are described in the Bible are, at their core, a matter of history and not a matter of myth.
Most archaeologists agree today that King David is a historical figure, that he was a charismatic leader, and it created something much bigger, more complex than was before him. Although the debate as to the extent is still going on,
David's history is set in the turbulent Middle East of 3,000 years ago. Egypt and Babylonia were the two dominant civilizations in the region. Between them lay the Mediterranean country called Canaan, populated mostly by Canaanites, Philistines, and Israelites, all competing for the same turf. They were constantly at war. The Israelites, at the time of David's life, consisted of 12 tribes who each occupied different portions of Canaan. Though the tribes often feuded among themselves, they were held together by the religion of Judaism and by common traditions. They developed further solidarity out of a sense of self-preservation when encroaching Philistines sought to push them out.
They are electing leaders who will protect them from the incursions of other local neighbors. The Philistines come from the Aegean. They have a warlike culture. They are aggressive. So after settling the coast, they are interested in beginning to move up into the central mountains.
The central mountains of Canaan were populated by the tribes of Benjamin and Judah. According to the biblical text, the two tribes had elected a king named Saul. His mandate was to deal with the Philistine threat.
And although Saul was successful now and then against the Philistines, he never had full tribal support. He was never able to really field an army under his control. He depended on volunteers, and the only volunteers that would usually join him were from the local tribes that were being attacked by their neighbors.
The Bible says that during one particular battle, Saul's forces and the forces of the Philistines had positioned themselves on opposing hills. Some people say that This is the hill where the Philistine army was positioned. Down below, the Valley of Elah.
The Valley of Elah itself is a very strategic way leading from the coastal plain, from Philistia, into the heartland of Judah.
It's entirely plausible that the two forces could have met right here in battle.
And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them.
The physical background, the geographical background of the battle, it's very credible. There's a description of the land which fits in very well with what we know of these places.
The method of ancient warfare the Bible describes is also credible. Historically, some generals, when faced with a huge and potentially costly battle, often declined a major engagement in favor of a single featured bout. They'd send out their two best warriors and settle the contest like a heavyweight prize fight. This is the context for the famous battle between David and Goliath.
I personally find the story plausible because it reflects Israelites engaging Philistines in warfare according to battle conventions that were familiar to the Philistines.
While the epic battle between David and Goliath is plausible from a historical perspective, there's absolutely no evidence to prove it ever actually happened.
It's not something that we can find as archaeologists. It's very difficult to identify small events, especially something like that.
The Bible says that a young shepherd volunteered for this epic one-on-one fight with Goliath. His name was David, a member of the Judah tribe and the youngest of 7 sons, raised by a sheep farmer from Hebron.
Like many great men in history, David appeared to have come from a commonplace background. But he distinguished himself by stepping out of the ranks of this large but unremarkable family and injecting himself into history.
He did it with a weapon that served 2 purposes. For a shepherd, the sling was useful for keeping wolves at bay. But for a soldier, it was a different story. The sling is a primitive but very effective weapon. It was simply a piece of braided wool like this that shepherds would get from their flocks, or a piece of plaited rawhide like this with a pouch sewn in the center. It allowed a skilled slinger to stand outside the range of his enemy's projectile weapons and still get the job done on his enemy. Now, it could be used in 2 ways, essentially. A slinger could use a large projectile like this one and load it into the pouch, in which case his sling, used in this manner, and launch the weapon up and over into his enemy's ranks. Or using a smaller projectile like this and an overhead motion with the sling. Suddenly, his sling became a flat trajectory, high-velocity weapon like a sniper rifle. Now, that kind of thing could do some serious damage. But there was another advantage. The sling is a weapon that David could easily hide until the very last moment, giving him the element of surprise against his heavily armed and bigger opponent. When David was finally in striking range, he revealed his sling and fired the lethal stone. Almost like a bullet, it was propelled through the air, and when it hit its mark, the center of Goliath's massive forehead, the mighty giant went down. In an instant, David was on it. He grabbed Goliath's sword and quickly beheaded him. When David held his enemy's head up for all to see, the psychological effect on the Philistines was devastating. They fled in terror. David, the unlikeliest champion, but the right man at the right place and the right time, became a hero.
I think this kind of sets the stage for David's entire career. That is, he's not a great warrior in the sense of power or strength, but he's smart. He's very intelligent.
The consequence of the victory of David and the Israelites was that the Philistines were expelled from the territory of the Israelites in the highlands back to their own territory.
After defeating Goliath, the Bible says that David joined King Saul's army. Showing his charisma and natural leadership abilities, David rose to the rank of captain of 1,000, which essentially meant he commanded a regiment. The biblical text gives us no information on his training, but we can imagine he quickly learned and mastered the weapons of the day, including the sword and the spear. In a short time, David became the ultimate warrior. Ironically, David's success backfired on him. His growing power caused Saul to consider him a threat.
Saul becomes so paranoid with David's success that he actually sends people to kill him. David escapes from the palace. He goes into the hill country south of Hebron, which is like the American Badlands.
David was now an outlaw, living a life on the run. And while he survived day to day, he had a long-range plan. A series of calculated moves would set the stage for the moment when he would achieve ultimate power. When David fled Saul's palace, he escaped certain death at the hands of assassins sent by a jealous king. Of course, his immediate concern was survival, but David was also a long-range planner. He began to formulate a scheme to grab absolute power among the Israelites. To do that, David needed an army.
Once David becomes an outlaw, other people from different parts of Israel, from among the tribes who are dissatisfied with Saul, are attracted to David. And in effect, David becomes a warlord in this mountainous area, slightly beyond the reach of Saul's organized army, but in an area where there are other tribes that are hostile to Israel.
David and his soldiers lived in caves and became experts in ancient guerrilla warfare. They were constantly on the move in order to evade capture or defeat.
He perfected the art of fighting with a small group of armed men, moving quickly, hitting and running. He went abroad in the countryside and attacked towns and settlements.
David's army was small, about 600 men, and his tactics were brutal. In this kind of guerrilla warfare, the rules of engagement were simple. There were no rules. He was fighting for his life, defending against raiders and soldiers sent by Saul, so he felt unhindered by morality or scruples.
It's a matter of tit for tat. The conventions of warfare are such that if you come and kill without discrimination, then the same thing will be done to you. There was no turning the other cheek.
David, a keen military strategist, devised a scheme that at first looked like a suicide mission. He enters Philistia, of all places, seeking an audience with his enemy, the king of Gath.
The Philistines had 5 major cities. Along the coast, you had, going from the north to the south, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. And then inland, you had Ekron and Gat. These 5 cities are known archaeologically. 4 of them have been excavated rather extensively.
These are the ruins at Gath, a Philistine city that was ruled by King Achish.
And David arose and passed over, he and the 600 men that were with him, unto Achish, king of Gath.
David apparently believed the old adage, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." And since Achish was the enemy of Saul, David needed him. So he took a chance and came here to strike a deal.
Saul's aggression against David is so great that David decides to seek protection from Saul's enemies, the Philistines. And he convinces one of the Philistine kings that he will be a loyal vassal.
King Achish thought that David would be raiding their mutual enemies, the people ruled by King Saul, but David devised a different plan.
What the text says he's really doing is that he's attacking other peoples in the area, those who are loyal to the Philistines, and he plunders everything. And the reason why nobody ever finds this out is that David kills every human, men, women, children. So no one ever lives to tell the story.
David is capable of acts of extraordinary violence and bloodshed. He's not a kind and gentle